You wanted the trees gone, Cynthia? You should have been more careful what you wished for. The first thing that woke me wasn't the chainsaw. It was the crack. Deep, sharp, heavy enough to rattle the coffee mug on my nightstand. Then came the mechanical howl outside my bedroom window, followed by another crack and the unmistakable rush of branches collapsing through leaves. I was out of bed before my feet were fully awake. The moment I opened the back door, the smell hit me. Gasoline, fresh sawdust, and raw pine sap hanging thick in the humid North Carolina morning. 3 men in orange safety vests were standing along my rear property line. One chainsaw screamed against a trunk, while another worker fed branches into a chipper. Beyond them, where 40 feet of green privacy had stood yesterday, sunlight poured through a hole that absolutely should not have existed. "Stop!" I shouted. The saw kept running. I crossed the wet grass barefoot, cold dew kicking against my ankles. Then another tree leaned. Slowly at first, almost gracefully. Its branches shivered against the pale morning sky before the whole thing dropped with a heavy crash that I felt through the soles of my feet. That tree had been there longer than my house. Now it was lying across my lawn in pieces. I reached the foreman and pointed toward the saw. "Shut it down. Right now." He killed the engine. The sudden silence felt enormous. Then I heard the soft electric whine of a golf cart approaching from the other side of the property line. Cynthia Langford rolled into view wearing white golf pants, sunglasses, and the calm little smile of someone arriving to inspect work she believed belonged to her. She was president of the Fairway Crest Estates HOA. I wasn't a member. My property wasn't inside Fairway Crest, and those trees were mine. "Nolan," she said, like I was the one creating a problem. "There's no reason to make this unpleasant." I looked past her. For the first time since buying the house, I could clearly see the 8th fairway of Silver Pines Golf Club. I could also see the oversized homes behind it, including Cynthia's. That was when I understood exactly what this was about. "Who authorized this?" I asked. Cynthia adjusted her sunglasses. "The association approved necessary vegetation management to restore the community golf view." I stared at the fresh stump beside my foot. Pale wood, wet sap, sawdust clinging to the grass like yellow snow. "This isn't community property." Her smile tightened. "That boundary has always been disputed." It hadn't. I had the survey pins to prove it. Cynthia looked through the new opening toward the golf course and smiled again. "Besides, everyone agrees the view is much better now." I didn't argue. Not then. I just looked at those stumps and counted them. 18. Cynthia thought 18 missing trees meant she had finally won. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 23 years fabricating commercial steel structures, and trees weren't the only thing a man could put along a property line. 3 weeks later, Cynthia would stand in almost that exact spot staring upward while a crane lowered the final panel into place. 20 feet of permitted American steel between Fairway Crest and the golf course view she'd stolen from my backyard. But that morning, with the chainsaws cooling in the grass and pine sap sticking to my bare feet, I didn't tell her any of that. I just smiled, pulled out my phone, and started taking pictures. My name is Nolan Mercer, and before that morning, I had spent 4 years believing I had found the one thing money rarely buys anymore: quiet. I was 46, divorced, and the owner of Mercer Structural Fabrication, a 12-person steel shop about 20 miles outside town. We built loading platforms, warehouse barriers, equipment frames, privacy structures, and the occasional custom job nobody else wanted to touch. I had spent 23 years around welding smoke, hot steel, grinding dust, and the steady hammering rhythm of people who made their living with their hands. By 6 every morning, my work boots usually smelled like machine oil before most people had poured their first cup of coffee. I bought the house because it sat outside Fairway Crest Estates. That detail mattered. The real estate agent had shown me the subdivision homes first, all matching stone mailboxes and perfect lawns, but I wanted no part of an association telling me what color to paint my shed. Then she showed me this place. 2.5 acres tucked against the western edge of Silver Pines Golf Club, with an old detached garage and a thick line of mature pine, oak, and sweet gum trees running behind the property. The deed was clean. The survey was clear. Fairway Crest began beyond my eastern boundary. My land did not belong to it. Those trees were one of the reasons I signed the papers. In summer, they turned the backyard into shade by late afternoon. When golfers rolled past on the 8th fairway, I heard little more than distant voices behind the leaves. In October, the oaks turned copper and red. During storms, I could sit beneath the covered porch with coffee and listen to rain tapping through thousands of leaves before it ever touched the ground. Privacy has a sound. I learned that after moving there. It sounds like wind instead of golf carts. Birds instead of conversations you were never meant to hear. Cynthia Langford apparently heard something different. About 6 months after I moved in, she appeared at my door carrying a cream-colored folder with the Fairway Crest logo embossed across the front. She introduced herself as HOA president and asked whether I would consider trimming several trees to improve visibility from the homes along the golf course. I told her I would think about ordinary maintenance, but I was not removing healthy trees. 2 weeks later, another request arrived. This one suggested topping them by 15 feet. I declined. Then came an offer from the HOA to pay for removing 6 trees entirely. I declined that too. Every conversation became a little less friendly. Cynthia started talking about view premiums, resale values, and community expectations as though my backyard were an accessory included with somebody else's mortgage. One Saturday afternoon, I found her standing near the rear boundary with 2 board members. She pointed toward the canopy and said, "Those trees are costing homeowners tens of thousands of dollars in golf views." I walked over to the survey marker, a small iron pin set flush with the ground, and tapped it with the toe of my boot. Then they bought houses with an expensive view of my trees. Neither board member laughed. Cynthia stared at me for several seconds before closing her folder. "There are always solutions, Mr. Mercer." I remember the dry click of that folder snapping shut. I remember her walking away. And I especially remember what she said to one of the board members when she thought I was too far behind them to hear. "Those trees will not be a problem much longer." At the time, I treated it like another empty HOA threat. Standing among 18 fresh stumps months later, phone in my hand and sawdust stuck to my feet, I finally understood that Cynthia had been giving me a warning. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes after I made the call, just as the morning heat began pulling the smell of pine resin out of every fresh stump. Deputy Aaron Mills stepped from his cruiser, adjusted his hat, and spent several quiet seconds looking across my backyard. The tree crew had shut down completely by then. Their chipper sat beside the property line with branches still sticking from its mouth, and nobody seemed interested in touching another chainsaw. Cynthia had parked her golf cart near the 8th fairway and was speaking into her phone like she was coordinating a corporate merger instead of explaining why 18 of my trees were lying across my grass. I showed Deputy Mills my deed, the survey I kept digitally stored on my phone, and photographs of the iron boundary pins. Cynthia immediately produced her own paperwork. "The association has a landscape maintenance easement," she said. Her voice had changed. No sweetness now, just certainty. The foreman, a tired-looking man named Ray, handed the deputy a work order bearing the Fairway Crest Estates letterhead. I noticed Cynthia's signature near the bottom. I noticed something else too. The parcel number printed above, it was not mine. One digit was wrong. Maybe it was a clerical mistake. Maybe it was not. Either way, I photographed it. Deputy Mills explained that determining property boundaries and easement rights was a civil matter, but he documented the scene and told everyone that no additional work should occur until ownership was clarified. Cynthia folded her arms. "This is ridiculous. The association has maintained that corridor for years." "No," I said. "You have looked at it for years." Her jaw tightened. Ray glanced from her to me, then quietly started gathering his equipment. That was when Cynthia made her first real mistake of the day. "The trees are already down," she said. "Arguing about it will not put them back." She said it casually, almost impatiently, as if irreversible damage somehow made permission unnecessary. I looked at her, then at the open strip where my privacy used to be. Through that gap, I could see golf carts moving along the fairway. I could see patio furniture behind 3 Fairway Crest homes. I could even see Cynthia's second-floor windows reflecting the morning sun. Yesterday, none of that had been visible. By noon, the crew was gone. Cynthia left without apologizing. The yard felt strangely exposed after everyone disappeared. No chainsaws, no chipper, just insects buzzing over piles of sawdust and the occasional distant click of a golf club. I walked the entire property line with my phone, photographing every stump, every tire track, every cut branch, and every survey marker. I measured what I could. I saved the deputy's incident number. Then I called Dale Whitcomb, an independent certified arborist I had worked with years earlier when my shop expanded its parking lot. Dale arrived that afternoon in an old green pickup with a clipboard and a diameter tape. He did not say much at first. He moved from stump to stump, measuring, photographing, identifying species, estimating age and replacement value. At the 18th stump, he removed his glasses and looked toward the fairway. These were not shrubs, Nolan. I know. Some of these were mature trees. This could get expensive. That evening, I received an email from Fairway Crest. I expected an apology or at least a request to discuss what had happened. Instead, the association instructed me to remove the remaining stumps and debris because the newly opened corridor was now visible from the golf course and created what they called an unfinished landscape condition. I read that sentence twice. Then I printed the email and set it beside Cynthia's work order. The printer hummed in my quiet kitchen. Outside, sunset poured through a space that had been shaded for decades. Cynthia had taken my trees, opened the view she wanted, and then ordered me to clean up the evidence. I poured another cup of coffee, opened a fresh folder, and wrote 2 words across the front. Fairway Crest. By 8 the next morning, the Fairway Crest folder was already thicker than it had any right to be. I had printed every email Cynthia had sent me since the first request to trim the trees, including the polite ones from 6 months earlier. I lined them across my kitchen table in chronological order, beside the survey, Deputy Mills's incident number, the photographs from the previous morning, and the work order with the wrong parcel number. Coffee steamed beside my elbow while the ceiling fan pushed warm air around the room. When you spend 23 years fabricating steel, you learn something important about mistakes. One bad measurement can ruin an entire structure. So when something looks wrong, you do not argue with it. You measure it again. I called the survey company that had handled my closing 4 years earlier. By 11, a surveyor named Paul Hensley was walking the rear boundary with a bright orange vest, a metal detector, and a fiberglass rod. The electronic locator chirped near the first iron pin, then the second, then the third. Each one landed exactly where my recorded survey said it should. Paul stretched the line between them and shook his head. Every stump was on my side. Not close. Not questionable. Mine. Several were more than 6 feet inside my property. There is no landscape easement shown here, he said. I asked him to check again. He did. Same answer. That afternoon, Dale sent his preliminary arborist report. 18 trees. Mature pine, oak, and sweet gum. Some were decades old. His report documented species, trunk diameter, condition, and estimated replacement impact. I printed that too. The warm pages slid from the printer carrying that sharp smell of fresh toner. Then my phone rang. It was Ray, the tree service foreman. His voice sounded different without chainsaws behind it. Careful, nervous. He told me his company had been assured in writing that Fairway Crest controlled the vegetation corridor. I asked who gave him that assurance. There was a pause. Then he said, Cynthia Langford. An hour later, an email arrived with 3 attachments. One was the work order I had already photographed. Another was a crude property map with a yellow strip drawn across the back of my lot. The third was an email chain between Cynthia and Ray. I read it slowly. She had pushed him to schedule the job before the weekend. She had described the trees as association-controlled landscaping. Then I reached one sentence that made the room go completely still. Cynthia had written, once they are down, he cannot put them back. I leaned against the counter and read it again. Not because I misunderstood it. Because I understood it perfectly. She had known I objected. She had known removal was permanent. And she had counted on permanence being her advantage. Outside my kitchen window, the afternoon sun poured across the exposed yard. A golf cart rolled along the 8th fairway. Beyond it, I could see Cynthia's house more clearly than ever. I closed the email, grabbed my keys, and drove to the shop. Mercer Structural Fabrication was almost empty when I arrived. The afternoon crew had gone home. The building smelled like cutting oil, steel dust, and yesterday's welding smoke. Somewhere near the back bay, a ventilation fan hummed steadily. I walked past stacks of square tubing and structural columns until I stopped beside a weathering steel panel we had fabricated for a commercial privacy project. 12 feet wide. Heavy. Solid. Built to stand outside for decades. I ran my hand across the cool metal surface. Cynthia's sentence came back to me. Once they are down, he cannot put them back. She was right about one thing. I could not put those trees back. I pulled out my phone and called Rachel Boone, the land use attorney who had handled permits for my shop expansion. When she answered, I asked her one question. Rachel, how tall can I legally build a freestanding privacy barrier on residential property? There was a short silence. That is an unusually specific question, Nolan. I looked through the open bay door at rows of steel catching the late sunlight. I have had an unusually specific week. Rachel called me back 40 minutes later, and by then I had already pulled the county zoning map onto the computer in my office. Rain tapped against the corrugated metal roof of the shop while I listened to her turn pages on the other end of the line. She had checked my parcel, the setback requirements, and the recorded covenants attached to the property. Then she said the words I had been waiting for. Your parcel is not subject to Fairway Crest architectural review. I leaned back in my chair. And the rear boundary. No recorded landscape easement. No association access rights. Nothing that gives Cynthia authority over your trees. That confirmed what Paul had already found, but hearing it from Rachel changed the temperature of the room. Cynthia had not stepped into some complicated gray area. She had simply acted as though confidence could substitute for ownership. Rachel warned me not to rush. Anything I built would need to satisfy county rules, drainage requirements, setbacks, structural standards, and permitting. Good, I said. I want every piece of paper. The next morning, I met her at the county planning office carrying a rolled survey under one arm. The place smelled like old carpet, printer toner, and burnt coffee. We spent nearly 2 hours asking questions. Not arguing. Not demanding favors. Just measuring the box the law gave me and making sure I stayed inside it. By lunchtime, I knew exactly what I could pursue. A freestanding privacy and sound barrier positioned entirely inside my property line, subject to engineering review and county approval. I drove straight back to the shop. My foreman, Lucas Barrett, was standing beside the plasma table checking dimensions for a warehouse order when I spread the survey across a steel workbench. He studied it, then looked at me. You are serious. Completely. We began with measurements. The exposed section behind my house ran just over 140 feet. I wanted the structure set comfortably inside the surveyed boundary, nowhere near Cynthia's imaginary corridor. Steel columns. Reinforced concrete footings. Weathering steel panels designed for exterior use. No decorations. No messages. No childish signs aimed at the HOA. Just a clean industrial privacy barrier built exactly where I had the legal right to build it. The plasma cutter came alive that afternoon with a high electric hiss. Bright sparks scattered beneath the table while the first mounting plates took shape. The smell of heated metal replaced pine sap in my head for the first time since the trees came down. Meanwhile, Cynthia apparently believed the argument was over. Fairway Crest sent homeowners an email celebrating what it called the restoration of previously obstructed golf course sightlines. Frank Delaney, who lived 2 houses down from Cynthia, forwarded it to me. He also sent a photograph of Cynthia standing beside the 8th fairway with 3 board members, pointing through the opening toward my property like she had personally discovered the horizon. I saved both files. 2 days later, another certified letter arrived at my house. Fairway Crest demanded that I grind the remaining stumps, remove the wood debris, and install association-approved ground cover along the newly visible area. I could smell fresh paper and adhesive when I opened the envelope. This time I did not feel angry. I almost laughed. Cynthia had become so comfortable giving orders that she had forgotten the most basic question. What happens when the person receiving them stops cooperating? I forwarded the letter to Rachel and continued working. The permit application went in that Friday with drawings, dimensions, footing specifications, drainage notes, and the stamped structural documents the county requested. Then I waited. That was the hardest part. Cynthia drove past the opening twice that weekend in her golf cart. On Sunday evening, she stopped long enough to call across my yard. Looks much better without all that clutter, does it not? I looked at the empty line of stumps, then at the survey stakes marking where the new footings would go. It definitely changed the view, I said. She smiled, satisfied, and drove away. Monday afternoon, my phone rang. Rachel did not waste time. Nolan, the permit is approved. I looked across the shop floor. 20-foot steel columns rested on timber blocks beneath the overhead lights, ready for loading. Good, I said. Schedule the concrete. The concrete truck rolled into my driveway at 5:38 Tuesday morning. its diesel engine humming low enough to vibrate through the kitchen windows. I was already outside with coffee in one hand and the approved permit folder in the other. The air was cool and damp, and thin fog rested over the 8th fairway beyond the empty tree line. Lucas arrived 10 minutes later with 2 crew trucks, followed by an auger rig and a flatbed carrying the first steel columns. Nobody needed a speech. We had measurements. We had drawings. We had a permit. Most importantly, we had survey stakes showing exactly where my property began and fairway crest ended. The auger started first. Its engine growled as the bit turned into the Carolina soil, pulling dark red clay from the ground in heavy spirals. One footing after another appeared along the line, each one positioned safely inside my parcel. By 7:15, Cynthia noticed us. I heard the electric whine of her golf cart before I saw her. She came around the edge of the fairway wearing a pale blue visor and carrying the same cream-colored HOA folder she always seemed to have nearby. She stopped on the other side of the boundary and stared at the equipment. "What exactly are you doing?" she called. I took another sip of coffee. "Improving my property." Her eyes moved from the auger to the flatbed. "With structural steel? That is generally what we use at my shop." She stepped closer, but stopped when she reached the orange survey line. I noticed that. Cynthia had finally learned to see a boundary. You cannot build an industrial structure facing fairway crest. I opened the permit folder and held up the county approval. It is a permitted residential privacy and sound barrier. She stared at the paper without taking it. The association never approved this. The association does not own this parcel. Her expression changed for half a second. Then the familiar smile returned. "Nolan, do not be ridiculous. Think about your neighbors." I looked through the opening her contractors had created. 3 fairway crest homes now had uninterrupted views across my backyard toward the golf course. I have been thinking about privacy quite a lot lately. Cynthia pulled out her phone and walked away while making calls. We kept working. Concrete filled the footing forms with a wet, grinding sound. Steel anchor assemblies disappeared into the gray surface one by one. By afternoon, the foundation line was complete. We gave it the required cure time, checked every measurement again, and scheduled the steel installation for Friday. Cynthia spent those days sending emails. One claimed I was threatening community aesthetics. Another demanded architectural drawings. A third warned that Fairway Crest would pursue all available remedies if construction continued. Rachel answered once, attaching the survey, deed records, and permit. After that, we stopped responding. Friday arrived clear and bright. At 6 in the morning, a mobile crane backed into position beside my detached garage. The flatbed behind it carried the columns and weathering steel panels we had fabricated at the shop. 20 feet of steel looks impressive lying horizontally. Standing upright, it changes the sky. The crane operator lifted the first column. The rigging tightened with a metallic creak. Slowly, the steel rose above my backyard, dark against the morning sun. Lucas guided it toward the first anchor assembly while I checked alignment. The column settled into position almost perfectly. Then came the second, then the third. By the time Cynthia's golf cart appeared, 5 columns were standing in a straight line where her precious view had been. She stopped so suddenly that dust rolled past her tires. "Nolan!" Her voice carried across the yard. The crane was already lifting the first panel. She hurried toward the property line with 2 board members behind her. "Stop this immediately. I am calling county enforcement." I looked at Lucas. He looked at me. Neither of us stopped. The panel climbed higher, sunlight flashing along its edge. Cynthia raised her phone. "You are destroying our golf course view." That sentence almost made me smile. I looked at the 18 stumps still visible beneath the steel columns. "No, Cynthia," I said. "I am restoring my privacy." Then I gave the crane operator the signal, and the first panel began its slow descent into place. The first panel settled between the columns with a deep metallic clang that rolled across the fairway and came back as a faint echo. Cynthia stopped talking. For 3 beautiful seconds, everyone did. Lucas checked the lower connection while I watched the panel standing exactly where the drawings said it would stand, entirely inside my property, 20 feet from bottom edge to top. It did not lean over the boundary. It did not touch HOA land. It simply existed, which seemed to offend Cynthia more than anything else. Then she found her voice. "You cannot possibly believe the county approved that." I handed her a copy of the permit. This time she took it. Her eyes moved across the page quickly, then returned to the approval stamp as though staring harder might change the ink. Behind her, one of the board members whispered something. Cynthia ignored him and called county code enforcement. We continued installing panels. The crane lifted the second sheet, then the third. Each one erased another section of the view fairway crest had been celebrating all week. By 9:30, homeowners had begun gathering along the golf course path. Some held coffee cups. Others stood beside golf carts, watching the steel line grow across the horizon. I heard complaints about property values. I heard someone ask whether it was permanent. Frank Delaney stood near the back of the group with his hands in his pockets and said nothing. He already knew why it was there. Around 10, a white county vehicle pulled up in front of my house. Inspector Melissa Grant walked into the backyard carrying a tablet and a measuring wheel. Cynthia hurried toward her before I could say a word. Thank goodness. This structure is completely inappropriate for our community. Melissa looked at her. Do you own this property? Cynthia hesitated. I represent the neighboring homeowners association. That was not my question. I almost spilled my coffee. Melissa spent the next 40 minutes doing exactly what I hoped she would do. She checked the permit number. She measured the setback. She compared the footing locations to the approved site plan. She verified the height and examined the structural documents. I stayed out of her way. So did Lucas. Cynthia did not. She followed Melissa from one end of the line to the other, explaining golf views, neighborhood character, architectural consistency, and resale premiums. Melissa finally turned toward her. Ma'am, those are association concerns. This parcel is outside your association. The words landed harder than any argument I could have made. Cynthia pointed toward the steel. So you are saying he can just put that there? Melissa glanced at her tablet. I am saying the work I inspected today matches the county-approved permit. Cynthia's face went still. The crane started moving again. By early afternoon, only one opening remained. Through it, I could see the 8th fairway, Cynthia's house, and a row of neighbors watching from the other side. The final panel rose from the flatbed, suspended by 2 straps, turning slowly in the sunlight. The weathering steel was still dark and clean, but overtime rain would give it a deep copper-brown finish. Cynthia stood near the survey line with her arms folded. You are doing this out of spite, she said. I shook my head. You removed the privacy I had. I replaced it. With a 20-foot wall. With a permitted barrier on my land. The crane operator eased the panel forward. The opening narrowed. Cynthia's house disappeared first. Then the golf carts. Then the bright green fairway became a thin vertical strip of color before vanishing completely. Lucas guided the panel into place. Metal met steel with one final clang. The backyard changed instantly. The noise from the golf course softened. The sightline was gone. For the first time since the trees fell, my property felt private again. Cynthia stared upward at 20 feet of steel and said quietly, This is not over. I believed her. People like Cynthia rarely stop when they lose control. They usually reach for paperwork. What she did not realize was that paperwork was exactly where I had been waiting for her. The paperwork arrived Monday morning in a thick white envelope that required my signature. Cynthia had moved fast. Fairway Crest was asking the county court for an emergency injunction, claiming my barrier created a visual nuisance, reduced neighboring property values, interfered with the established character of the golf community, and somehow threatened drainage despite the fact that county inspectors had already reviewed the plans. I stood at my kitchen counter reading every page while rain ticked softly against the windows. The steel outside had already started darkening from its original gray, the first faint traces of weathering appearing along the surface. I called Rachel. She listened quietly while I read the complaint. Do not touch the wall, she said. Do not contact Cynthia. Send me everything. 2 days later, we were sitting in a small county courtroom beneath fluorescent lights that hummed like old shop equipment. Cynthia sat across the aisle with the Fairway Crest attorney and 3 board members. She wore a navy blazer and the expression of someone who expected paperwork to accomplish what intimidation had not. Their argument sounded polished until the judge asked one simple question. What specific property right does the association claim has been violated? Their attorney started talking about protected golf course sightlines. Rachel stood. Protected by what recorded instrument? Silence. Pages turned. Cynthia whispered to her attorney. He shifted to community expectations and historical views. Rachel placed my recorded deed and Paul Hensley's certified survey on the table. Then she introduced the county permit and Melissa Grant's inspection report. Everything was measured. Everything was documented. Everything was inside my boundary. The judge looked toward Fairway Crest again. So the association does not own this parcel? No, Your Honor. And Mr. Mercer is not a member of the association? Another pause. No, Your Honor. That should have been enough, but Rachel was not finished. She asked why the association believed the Gulf View required protection in the first place. Their attorney explained that mature vegetation had recently been removed, creating a restored sightline that homeowners had come to rely upon. Rachel opened the folder I had started the morning after the trees fell. I recognized the page before she even lifted it. Cynthia's email to Ray. The courtroom seemed quieter as Rachel read the important sentence aloud. Once they are down, he cannot put them back. Cynthia's posture changed. Rachel followed with the tree service work order, the incorrect parcel number, photographs of 18 stumps, Dale Whitcomb's arborist report, and Ray's written statement confirming Cynthia had represented the vegetation as association controlled. Then came the Fairway Crest email celebrating the newly restored golf course sightlines. The same view they now wanted a court to preserve had been created by removing trees from property they did not own. Cynthia tried to whisper something to her attorney, but there was nowhere left for the story to go. The documents had already told it. The judge denied the emergency injunction. No dramatic speech. No shouting. Just paper sliding across a desk and a decision entered into the record. Outside the courthouse, Cynthia caught up with us near the steps. You think this makes you right? She asked. Rachel touched my arm before I answered. I looked at Cynthia and remembered the chainsaws, the sawdust, the 18 stumps, and that sentence she had written because she believed permanence worked only in her favor. No, I said. The survey did that. Rachel and I walked toward the parking lot. Behind us, Fairway Crest's attorney was still talking to the board members. Frank called me that afternoon. Homeowners had started demanding financial records, meeting minutes, and an explanation for why association money had paid for tree removal on land outside the subdivision. 3 board members wanted a special meeting. 2 wanted Cynthia removed as president. And Rachel had already prepared my counterclaim for trespass, property damage, arborist costs, survey expenses, and legal fees. Cynthia had gone to court hoping to make me remove the steel. Instead, she had placed every document I needed under the brightest light possible. The settlement took 6 weeks, and by then the steel had begun turning the deep copper-brown color I knew it would. Every rainstorm changed it a little more. Fairway Crest changed too. Frank kept me updated as homeowners packed 2 emergency meetings and demanded answers about legal bills, tree service invoices, and the authority Cynthia had claimed she possessed. The board minutes eventually confirmed what the documents had already shown. No vote had ever authorized entering my property. No recorded easement existed. Cynthia had signed the tree service paperwork herself and presented the removal as routine landscape maintenance. Once the association's insurance carrier saw Ray's statement, Paul's certified survey, Dale's arborist report, and Cynthia's email, the tone changed quickly. Nobody was talking about community aesthetics anymore. They were talking about numbers. Rachel handled the negotiations while I went back to work. I preferred it that way. The shop sounded normal again. Grinders hummed. Forklifts beeped across the concrete floor. The air smelled like cutting oil and warm steel instead of legal paper and burnt coffee. Fairway Crest eventually agreed to compensate me for the destroyed trees, reimburse the survey and arborist expenses, cover my documented property restoration costs, and pay the legal fees tied to the dispute. The agreement also recognized the surveyed boundary and confirmed that the association had no authority to demand removal of my permitted barrier. Cynthia resigned as president 3 days before the board was scheduled to vote on removing her. Frank told me the announcement lasted less than 5 minutes. No applause, no grand speech, just a motion, a resignation letter, and an empty chair at the front table. I never celebrated that part. I did not need Cynthia embarrassed. I needed her authority over my property to end. With part of the settlement money, I called Dale and asked him to help me restore what could actually be restored. We chose native trees suited to the soil and planted them well inside my boundary. Young oaks, pines, and sweet gums that would eventually bring back the shade and birds I had lost. They were nowhere near the size of the old trees. Some things cannot be replaced on a convenient schedule. That was the lesson Cynthia had missed when she wrote that sentence to Ray. Once they are down, he cannot put them back. She had treated permanence like a weapon. I treated it like a responsibility. By early fall, the backyard felt like mine again. The young trees moved softly in the breeze. The old stumps had been removed. Fresh grass covered the scars where equipment had crossed the lawn. And behind, everything stood 140 feet of weathering steel, quiet and legal, blocking the view that had started the entire mess. One Saturday morning, I carried a mug of coffee onto the porch just after sunrise. The air smelled like damp soil and fallen leaves. I could hear golfers somewhere beyond the barrier, but I could not see them. That was exactly how I liked it. Then came a sudden metallic clang. Something dropped into the grass near the wall. I walked over and found a white golf ball resting beside one of the new oak trees. I picked it up and turned it between my fingers. For a second, I remembered Cynthia standing in my yard explaining that everyone agreed the view was better without my trees. I looked up at 20 feet of copper-colored steel glowing in the morning sun. She had spent association money removing 18 trees because she wanted a clearer view across land that never belonged to her. In the end, she lost her position, the association paid for the damage, and the view she wanted so badly became the one thing nobody in Fairway Crest could see anymore. I set the golf ball on my workbench and went back to my coffee. Justice did not need a chainsaw, an argument, or a raised voice. Sometimes it just needed a survey, a permit, patience, and 20 feet of steel standing exactly where the law said it could.